Hello, everyone. This is going to pick up where our last video left off that discussed non-flowering plants. So in this video, we'll talk about flowering plants, the so-called angiosperms. And if we go back to our phylogeny, we can see that the lineage giving rise to angiosperms split from the lineage giving rise to gymnosperms about 250 million years ago. And of course, both lineages share seeds in common, but now in the evolution of flowering plants, we're going to see flowers become a new important innovation, as well as double fertilization and the evolution of things like fruit. And angiosperms, as it turns out, represent the most diverse group of land plants with clearly over 300,000 different species and maybe some still left to be described or some taxonomic uncertainties that still exist, but we're pretty confident that there are probably more than 300,000 species of flowering plants, and trying to get an explanation of how so much diversification could have unfolded in this group is something that a lot of botanists and evolutionary biologists try to understand. But one of the best explanations is that the kinds of traits that flowering plants have are just so advantageous for life on land that they have allowed a widespread diversification to happen within this lineage in, I wouldn't say a short period of time, but it's much more diversification than we've seen, certainly in any of the other plant groups, and more diversification than we've seen in any of the taxonomic groups that we've looked at so far, with the exception of animals. And so what are flowering plants? Well, obviously, these are plants that produce flowers, which are modified leaves. They are sporophylls. And flowering plants generally include plants that can be woody, so they can have cells with secondary walls that eventually give rise to lignin, or they can have plants that are herbaceous. So there are plenty of forbs or things like grasses that are included in flowering plants that don't produce wood. Flowering plants include taxa that are evergreen, that keep their leaves all year long, or taxa that drop their leaves during the winter, which are deciduous. And all flowering plants are vascular. So this theme of having xylem and phloem has not been lost in the flowering plants. It's a well-conserved trait that was inherited from the common ancestor of flowering plants and gymnosperms. Some flowering plants take on an annual life history strategy, which is to say they only live for one growing season, do all of their photosynthesis and reproduction, make seeds, die back, and then that life history cycle repeats itself in subsequent growing years. Or they can be perennial, which is to say that they live for multiple growing seasons. So they'll undergo photosynthesis, reproduction. They'll make offspring, but they'll continue to live into subsequent generations and probably repeatedly reproduce in those generations. And one of the major innovations, aside from the fact that angiosperms have flowers, is that yes, they produce seeds, but they're producing their seeds in fruits. And these fruits really derive from specialized structures that protect the ovaries within the female reproductive organs of these flowers. And these protected female reproductive organs are, again, yet another trait we see that probably help explain how it is that angiosperms were really able to make sort of the final push towards land plants colonizing even more increasingly arid environments. So by virtue of having seeds protected within sort of enclosed structures, that enables those seeds to be really, really good at avoiding desiccation resistance, even better than gymnosperms were. And I would point out that the word gymnosperm means naked seed because gymnosperm seeds are not protected within enclosed structures, whereas angiosperm seeds are. And we call those enclosed structures carpels. So basically, we can uh, talk about the two major divisions of angiosperms being divided into so-called monocots and eudicots, and we'll discuss their phylogeny in a moment. But monocots include things like grasses or lilies. These are probably familiar plants that have very, very different floral structures, whereas eudicots include things like sunflowers or roses, which again have very, very different floral structures from one another and very, very different floral structures from those that we see in monocots. And when we talk about floral structures, what exactly are we talking about? Well, we're talking about these flowers. And these flowers generally are composed of perianths and also male and female reproductive organs that we term androecium and gynoecium, respectively. So the perianth of flowers includes their sepals and their petals, also termed their calyx and their corolla in some literature. And then the androecium are the male reproductive organs, which includes the stamen, which are made up of anthers and filaments, and the pistil, which is the female reproductive organ, the gynoecium, which is composed of a stigma that receives pollen, a style that allows that stigma to extend from the ovary, and then the ovary itself, which contains the ovules within which are the eggs. And so at the tips of these anthers are where pollen grains are produced, and the pollen grains typically will find their way from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower, and the pollen grain will land on that stigma and grow a pollen tube down to the ovary of that female reproductive organ, and attempt to fertilize the eggs within the ovule using sperm that are in that pollen grain. So that theme of pollen fertilization that we saw in gymnosperms is still conserved in angiosperms. The major difference being that we have these very distinctive male and female reproductive organs and these distinctive perianths. There's a pretty specific genetic system used to determine floral organ identity in flowering plants. It's called the ABC model of homeotic genes. We won't go into the detail of it here, but do know that the different combination of homeotic genes are responsible for producing sepals or petals or androecium or gynoecium. If fertilization is successful in flowering plants, then the eggs within the ovules will become fertilized and will basically double in chromosome number. So if the sperm and egg are haploid, the fertilized eggs will be diploid. And those diploid eggs will develop eventually into seeds that'll be held within these protected structures called carpels, and those carpels will eventually develop into fruits. This example here shows apples, which are a pretty familiar fruit from the rose family. They're actually analogous to rose hips. But there is a tremendous variety of different kinds of fruits that are produced by angiosperms. This just being one example. There are a lot of interesting variations on the theme of fruits, and there are certainly fruits that don't appear to be fruits at all, or fruits that sort of violate our basic thinking about what makes fruits fruits. And the terminology is rather vague. But botanically speaking, things that are referred to as vegetables often are fruits, like bell peppers, for example, or jalapeno peppers are fruits, just like tomatoes are fruits. In fact, jalapenos and bell peppers and tomatoes belong to the same flowering plant family and are analogous fruit-like structures. As we saw in gymnosperms and also in seedless vascular plants, there are xylem and phloem within the stems of angiosperms. So this vascular theme certainly hasn't gone away. In fact, the theme of the vascular system in angiosperms has become even more complicated because these flowering plants now have what we call vessel elements, which are kind of more advanced vascular structures that really make water transport super effective in these plants. Again, representing an adaptation that probably really was conducive to allowing flowering plants to begin further colonizing areas that were further and further away from water. Again, these are plants generally that are becoming more and more adapted to increasingly drier conditions, and kind of representing the final push towards the not only the evolution of land plants, but the colonization of increasingly arid terrestrial habitats by land plants. So angiosperms have their life cycle, which isn't terribly different than the life cycle we saw in gymnosperms, and certainly still maintains the theme of alternation with generations. Basically, what we're going to see in the angiosperm life cycle are anthers and ovaries. These are male reproductive parts and female reproductive parts, both of which have evolved to shelter gametophytes. And so much like we saw in gymnosperms, the gametophyte stage is extremely inconspicuous, whereas the sporophyte stage is by far the most conspicuous stage of the life cycle. But either way, when the pollen grains produced by anthers successfully fertilize the eggs of ovaries, it does give rise to seeds that are enclosed within fruits. And again, both seeds and fruits are very important adaptations that allow the offspring of these plants to resist desiccation and to be able to persist sometimes in relatively dormant conditions. So this cartoon here does show the angiosperm life cycle. And is a lot of terminology going on in the angiosperm life cycle because there are a lot of detailed anatomical features possessed within flowers that we don't see in other land plant taxa. But effectively, what I want you to think about are these different reproductive structures: gynoecium, the female reproductive structures, and andrecium, the male reproductive structures. And effectively, these male reproductive structures have microsporangium, and these female reproductive structures have megasporangium, not too different than the theme we saw in gymnosperms. And let's start thinking about this from what's going on at the anther. So the anther is going to produce these pollen grains, which are effectively microgametophytes. And we can typically think about there being two kinds of important cells within the pollen grains of angiosperms, which we call generative cells and tube cells. Generative cells are the cells that, if lucky, are the sperm cells that will get to fertilize the eggs in the ovules. And tube cells are the cells that will undergo mitosis to grow a pollen tube, which is not that different than what we saw going on in gymnosperms. So effectively, a lucky pollen grain will find its way onto the tip of a stigma of a gynoecium. And if that happens, that pollen grain will extend or grow its pollen tube down to the ovary via mitosis, and that pollen grain will sort of attach to the ovules within the ovary, which contain the female megagametophytes, and the sperm cells, the generative cells, will be sent down that pollen tube to the ovule. There are a number of haploid different kinds of haploid cells in the ovule, only one of which is the actual egg cell that's going to be fertilized. And these other meiotic cells are kind of like supportive cells, if you can think of that. So they do serve kind of a function, but they're not going to be directly involved in the process of fertilization. So if these microgametophytes are successful at basically dispersing onto the stigma, sperm will find its way down to the ovary into an ovule, and it will fertilize the egg within the megagametophyte, and a zygote will be formed. And that zygote will give rise to an embryo, and that embryo will be housed within a seed. And within that seed are some even more detailed structures shown in this sort of microscopic image here. There are these two cotyledons, and these cotyledons sort of extend off of the zygote. And if this seed is capable of germinating, those cotyledons will become the first two leaves that will emerge after the seed germinates. And these cotyledons and this embryo within this embryo are housed in a bunch of endosperm, which is this rich starchy tissue, sort of like we saw in gymnosperms. This rich starchy tissue enables the seed to survive for long periods of time in dormancy. So basically the embryo is going to be living off of this endosperm, slowly metabolizing it, waiting for the chance to germinate so that it can send up its cotyledons and start doing photosynthesis, thus making new food or making its own food, so it doesn't have to rely on endosperm anymore. The radicle inside of the embryo will eventually give rise to the first root. So if this seed germinates, basically its radicle will differentiate into roots, and its cotyledons will differentiate into shoots. And all of these seeds, all these embryos are held within seeds, and these seeds are typically held within fruits. So this is a picture here showing a pea pod. And a pea pod is a sort of classic kind of fruit. Obviously, this is what Gregor Mendel was studying. These pea pods, within which were these seeds that we call peas. Of course, again, there is a tremendous amount of variation in seed morphology amongst different flowering plant species, and a tremendous amount of variation in the morphology of fruit structures among flowering plant species. Angiosperms do undergo double fertilization. What the heck is this? So basically, we have a situation where a sperm cell is going to fertilize one egg, and another sperm cell is going to fertilize a diploid nucleus within the embryo sac of the megagametophyte. that all sounds complicated. So let's take a step back. First of all, we have the megagametophyte. This is basically going on within the gynoecium, the female reproductive part of the flower. And we have the microgametophyte. This is basically the pollen grain that came from the male reproductive organ. And we know that that pollen grain has regenerative cells and tube cells. And so this tube cell comes down, forms this pollen tube that allows sperm to reach this megagametophyte. And this pollen tube is actually going to send down two sperm cells. Didn't mention that before, but it does. And one of those sperm cells is going to fertilize the egg cell within the megagametophyte, and the other sperm cell is going to fertilize the polar nuclei of the embryo sac. And the polar nuclei, as the name suggests, has two, well, maybe the name doesn't suggest, but it has two nuclei. And so what effectively is going to happen here is that the egg cell will be fertilized, giving rise to a diploid zygote, assuming that the sperm cell and egg cells are haploid. So we'll have a diploid zygote formed, which will give rise to the embryo. But then we also have this other sperm cell that's fertilizing the polar nuclei, giving rise to triploid endosperm. So endosperm is comprised of cells that have 3 sets of chromosomes, which is kind of bizarre, but that is indeed what's happening. And this endosperm, again, is a very rich starchy material that the developing diploid embryo will use as a food source within the seed as that seed awaits germination. So double fertilization is a really important innovation we see that is conserved across all angiosperm taxa, that almost certainly has evolved in order to enable the seeds within the fruits to survive long periods of time prior to germination, presumably as an adaptation to surviving desiccation, to surviving survival in relatively dry conditions for long periods of time as that seed awaits germination. Another interesting artifact of flowering plants has to do with their sort of floral organ identity. And so when we look at this flower here in this cartoon, what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a bisexual flower, or really, by definition, a hermaphrodite, an organism that carries both female and male reproductive organs on the same individual. This is kind of a bizarre situation that we don't see in a lot of other species, but it happens in many flowering plants. And we might ask questions about, well, can these hermaphrodites self-fertilize? Yes, they can in some situations, although that's not the best situation because plants that are self-fertilized have a higher probability of basically allowing harmful combinations of gene variants or alleles to pair up during fertilization, kind of leading to a level of inbreeding. So it's not in the best interest of hermaphroditic or bisexual plants to self-fertilize, but if they can't cross-fertilize, then they potentially could self-fertilize, although we know that self-incompatibility has evolved in a number of flowering plant lineages. That is to say that there are chemical mechanisms within the ovaries of these plants that actually enable them to recognize if they are receiving pollen grains that carry the same or very similar genetic information. Those pollen grains will be refused. So in some cases, hermaphrodites can undergo self-fertilization. In other cases, they are entirely self-incompatible. But what does this mean? Well, it means it allows an opportunity for us to have these bisexual organisms. But not all flowers are bisexual. We can have what we call incomplete flowers or imperfect flowers. So these could be flowers that only carry male reproductive organs. So we could have effectively what we would call staminate plants that only have stamen and they have no pistils. In contrast, we could have pistillate plants that only have pistils and have no stamen. And we can have individual plants that carry pistillate flowers and staminate flowers on the same individual. And we can have plants that carry pistillate flowers and staminate flowers on separate individuals. And oftentimes when we have plants that carry pistillate flowers and staminate flowers on the same individual, they produce those flowers at different times. For example, in oaks or walnuts, typically the staminate flowers are produced first and their pollen is dispersed first. Only later do the pistillate flowers emerge, and we think this is probably an adaptation that prevents outcrossing. If the male functioning flowers are produced first, there are no opportunities for them to self-fertilize because there are no female flowers. Anyway, there are some interesting terms we use for these conditions. Obviously, this is an example of sexual dimorphism, which we commonly think of as something that happens in animals a lot more frequently than plants, but it does happen in plants as well. And we can think of this as probably being some artifact of sexual selection in plants. Basically, non-hermaphroditic seed plants can be either monoecious or dioecious. What do these terms mean? Well, first of all, let's imagine we have a plant with hermaphrodite flowers. So all the flowers contain both male and female reproductive organs, just like we see in this cartoon here. Well, that's a hermaphrodite. A monoecious plant would be a plant that has separate male and female flowers on the same individual. In fact, the term monoecious means one house. So the male and female flowers are contained within a single house or within a single individual plant. In contrast, we could have species that are dioecious, or they have two houses, which is to say that female flowers are held on one plant and male flowers are held on a separate plant, sort of two separate houses or two separate individual plants that house either separate female flowers or male flowers, making those plants functionally male or female. And this has evolved in many, many plant lineages. So we see this in tons and tons of flowering plants. And we see it in both, we also see this in gymnosperms. So for example, if we look at California junipers, as shown here, these are dioecious conifers. And so these junipers will have separate male plants that produce male cones and separate female plants that produce female cones. Frequently, people call these juniper berries, but they're not berries by any stretch of the imagination, because berries are fruits, and fruits only occur in angiosperms, and junipers are not angiosperms. They're gymnosperms. They don't make fruit. So even though these superficially resemble berries, they are kind of fleshy. They, in fact, are female cones. But the point is that sexual dimorphism probably evolved at some time in the lineage, way back in the lineage, that gave rise to the common ancestor of both gymnosperms and angiosperms, probably somewhere around here, something like maybe 250 to 300 million years ago. So we do see sexual dimorphism in flowering plants. And that is an interesting aspect of their life history. Probably, again, an adaptation that really helps promote outcrossing amongst individual plants. So let's take a look at angiosperm diversity. It's a little bit complicated, but we'll break it down into its simplest interpretation. Obviously, this is the most diverse group of all land plants, so it inherently has a whole bunch of interesting caveats in its diversification. But again, in simplest terms, we can break it down into we can break the phylogeny down into the early diverging angiosperms, which are represented by these groups here, and also the magnoliids, which are kind of an early diverging group as well, and then the monocots and eudicots. And so these large fan-like triangles basically represent large-scale diversification, as if to suggest there's a lot of evolutionary change going on within this branch, a lot of evolutionary change going on in this branch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And keep in mind that this particular phylogeny is really encapsulated in just this one single branch of the land plant evolutionary tree. So if we were to look in more detail, or if we were to zoom into the angiosperm phylogeny, this in fact is what it would look like. And so when we're talking about the early diverging groups, we're talking about a paraphyletic branch because it includes the common ancestor of all angiosperms, but not all of the descendants of that common ancestor, i.e. the early diverging groups don't include monocots and eudicots. That lineage later branched off. So the major early diverging groups are Amborella, which is a single genus of flowering plants, and as far as we can tell from the fossil record, the earliest diverging group of flowering plants. which I think is only represented by one genus. The nymphales, which includes things like Nuphar lutea, the water lilies. So if you've seen paintings or seen these plants in person, you're looking at very early diverging flowering plants. The Austrobaileales, which includes things like Schisandra. So this is an image of that here. And of course, the magnoliids. And you've probably seen magnolias because they're commonly planted all over the place as urban ornamental trees. And they are sort of the last early diverging group of angiosperms. And there isn't exactly a whole lot of uniformity in terms of the floral structure and the general anatomy of these plants. They kind of represent what we might think of as the earliest angiosperms wandering around trying to find their definitive features. So if we look at Schisandra, we can count the number of these things we might call tepals. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. That's actually kind of like what we see in monocots. If we look at Nuphar, maybe it's a little bit more indistinct. And so there are just characteristics that we see in the early diverging angiosperms that are a little bit vague compared to very clear-cut characteristics that make monocots quite unique and also make eudicots kind of quite unique. And so then we can look at the two major groups, monocots and dicots. And this is a pretty good depiction of the monocot phylogeny. So if we were to zoom in at this sort of major diversification event or this major branch of the angiosperm tree, we would see something like this, points towards all these major orders within the monocots. And there are some key features that generally unite monocots as a pretty nice monophyletic group or a clade. And generally those are seen in some morphological features and developmental features. So for instance, monocots, as their name suggests, only possess one cotyledon. So if we were to look at this image here, this actually is a eudicot embryo because it has two cotyledons. If we were looking at a monocot, we'd only see one cotyledon. So that is one unifying characteristic in the development of monocots. Their leaves tend to have parallel venation, and their leaves tend to be kind of strap-like. So a lot of familiar monocot leaves, such as we see in lilies or aloes or yuccas or palms, have parallel venation. And typically their flower parts are found in either 3s or 6s. And so we might see sepals arranged in 3s, and we might see petals arranged in 3s, or we might see sepals and petals that are indistinct from one another, but they're still arranged in 3s. So we might see 6 tepals, as they're called. When we have indistinct sepals and petals, they're called tepals. But either way, in monocots, petals and sepals are generally arranged in 3s or 6s, as are the andrecium and gynoecium. So we typically might see 3 or 6 stamen in monocots and 3 or 6 pistils in monocots. And that is a really good key characteristic that we can use to, if we're looking at a flower in hand, we can use those characteristics to say this is a monocot or not. And if we were to dig up a monocot, we notice that these plants have adventitious roots, which is a fancy way of saying they have really stringy root systems. They don't have a nice, well-defined taproot as we see in a lot of eudicots. So that's yet another fairly defining characteristic of monocots. And almost all monocots are not woody, so they don't produce lignin. They're not making that secondary cell wall and allowing that secondary cell wall to die for structural purposes. Most of them are not woody. Even those that kind of appear woody really are not truly woody. So these images here show a select sampling of some fairly well-known monocots. Yucca brevifolia, the Joshua tree, pretty famous in California, is a monocot. It looks woody. It looks tree-like. Well, it is tree-like, but it in fact does not truly produce wood. Agaves are another example of monocots. They have these narrow strap-like leaves. And both of these two taxa belong to the Asparagales, by the way. We could talk about orchids, which are one of the most diverse plant families in the world. Tons and tons of species of orchids exist, and they are all monocots. And here we can count the number of tepals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, although one of them looks a little bit odd. It's differentiated into a sort of attractive structure, presumably for securing pollination or for allowing pollinators to have a place to obtain nectar. Anyway, orchids are yet another very well-known group of monocots. Zingibers, which is the genus of gingers. So this is a ginger flower here. It's actually a fairly attractive flower. These are found within the order Zingiberales. And palms. So I had mentioned cycads before, which superficially look like palms. They're not even directly closely related to palms at all. Palms fall within the Ericales. So Washingtonia foliifera is the native California fan palm. These are a classic monocot, and they have, if we were to look carefully at the palm fronds, we'd see parallel venation in their leaves. And again, these plants appear woody because they have trunks, but they're really not woody plants. And things like triticum, this is common wheat. And so triticum is a member of the Poales, the order of grasses. And believe it or not, these are flowering plants, and these are the little flowers here emerging from the inflorescences of this wheat plant. And so these are all examples of monocots that are fairly familiar, at least to us. There are many others as well, such as lilies or asparagus or other examples that are not as common in North America, but certainly there is quite a diversity of different monocots, and they all generally share these characteristics in common. We can also look at the eudicot tree. So this is the eudicot phylogeny. And again, this phylogeny here represents all the diversification in this particular branch of the angiosperm phylogeny. And as it turns out, the eudicots are by far the most diverse group of angiosperms, representing at almost 70% of all angiosperm taxa. So a ton of diversity going on here. And basically, this phylogeny is broken down into some groups that might be pretty familiar, the asterids and rosids probably being the two most familiar, and some of these other groups as well. What are some of the unifying developmental and morphological characteristics of eudicots? Well, rather than having a single cotyledon as the embryo is developing, they have two cotyledons, hence the name dicot or eudicot. And so this embryo here that we looked at has two cotyledons. This is probably a eudicot. And instead of having parallel venation in the leaves, most eudicots have networked veins. So they have this really branch-like network of venation or vasculature going through their leaves, very different than we see in monocots. And likewise, their flower parts do not occur in 3s or 6s. They occur in 4s or 5s or more. So if we were to look at a eudicot flower, we might see 4 or 5 sepals, or 4 or 5 petals, or 4 or 5 stamen, or 4 or 5 pistil. Or in some cases, we might see 4 or 5 stamen and only 1 pistil. Generally, if we see 4 sepals, we're going to see 4 petals. And then the number of pistil and stamen kind of goes from there. If there are 4 sepals and petals, you might expect to find 4 stamen and 4 stigma. Kind of depends. Likewise, if there are 5 sepals, there probably are going to be 5 petals, and likewise probably 5 stamen and maybe 5 pistils. But again, it's not uncommon for plants with 5 sepals, petals, and stamen to only have a single pistil. Or more, as we might see, for example, in things like roses, which have many, many stamen, or things like cactus, which also have many, many stamen. And both of those are eudicots, by the way. And there are some very familiar examples of eudicots. If we were to start talking about asterids, these are things like the mints. So Salvia leucophylla is a member of the mint family. It has these classically bilaterally symmetric flowers, or zygomorphic flowers, or things like Solanum, the common garden tomato, also is a member of the asterids. These things tend to have more radial symmetry in their flowers, but they share some common ancestry at some point, nevertheless. Things like hibiscus, should probably pretty famously known from the Trader Joe's logo, the hibiscus flower, which is a member of the rosids, or things like these pea flowers in the genus Lathyrus. This is like the flowers produced by common garden peas. These are really all very species that all belong to very diverse plant families: the mint family, the nightshade family, the mallow family, and the pea family. Very diverse groups represented by a lot of diversity, not just in California, but globally. We can also talk about things like cacti. So Opuntia littoralis is the coast prickly pear we have in California. Again, with those spines that are modified leaves and these really fleshy stems that are really good at conserving water. Yet another example of an adaptation for life on land in particularly arid environments. And these flowers that have more than 4 or 5 parts. We see many, many petals, probably many, many sepals if we were to look closely, and many, many, many stamen. And these opuntias belong to the group Caryophyllales, which is a group that includes many succulent plants. So we think succulents probably emerged early on in the lineage, giving rise to the Caryophyllales. And then things like Eschscholzia californica, the California poppy. This is the state flower. And we can find these things growing wild all over the deserts and also some coastal areas. And it's actually a pretty diverse group of plants. The California poppy is not the only species. There are other species as well we can find, some of which are herbaceous, some of which are woody. And these are members of the ranunculales, the so-called buttercups. And they have some interesting characteristics as well. And as you're probably noticing pretty quickly, a tremendous amount of beautiful color is seen in the pigments produced by these flowers. And there are different reasons why there's such a diversity of pigments that probably have arisen in these flowers. And a lot of it probably has to do with these pigments facilitating the ability of these flowers to become pollinated by animal vectors. And as I mentioned, the evolution of such variation in pigments and really colors related to those pigments amongst the eudicots, and also, well, not just the eudicots, but amongst the angiosperms, is really intricately tied to the fact that all of these species generally depend upon external vectors for pollination. So way back when we talked about gymnosperms, we were talking about a situation where, for the most part, pollination was going to be happening by wind dispersal. So those male gametophytes, which we call pollen grains, really only have one way to find I really only have one route to find a way to a potential female megagametophyte for fertilization, and that's by wind fertilization. Whereas now, when we're talking about these angiosperms, they're not really relying on wind pollination so much. Some taxa are. The ones I'm showing here are not. There are some angiosperm taxa with far less showy flowers, very inconspicuous flowers that are wind pollinated still. But when we start talking about these taxa with really showy, colorful flowers, we're usually talking about species that depend upon animal vectors for pollination. And that's an interesting situation because that is something that has given rise to what we call pollination syndromes. What's a pollination syndrome? It's a situation where plant species have evolved dependence upon external vectors in order for their pollen grains to be transferred from the flowers of one individual to the flowers of another. Specifically, to have the pollen from the androecium of one individual flower transferred to the gynoecium of the flower of another individual, therefore allowing outcrossing to happen. And because wind isn't super effective at doing this, the way that angiosperm evolution has unfolded is that a lot of taxa, perhaps more than 80% of angiosperm taxa, have developed very intricate relationships where they depend upon some type of an animal vector to move pollen from flower to flower. And a lot of the morphology, including the shape and the color of these flowers, have evolved as adaptations that facilitate pollination by animal vectors. And so that's kind of what a pollination syndrome is. In other words, some of these flowers probably couldn't reproduce without pollinating vectors or without animal pollinators. So what's really going on during the process of pollination? It's very indirect. Most of these animal pollinators are not interested in pollen. They are interested in nectar. And most flowers produce nectar, which is very rich in sugar, which provides an excellent, quick, bang energy source for these animals. And by virtue of these animals having to struggle just a little bit to get inside these flowers down into the nectaries, which are usually positioned somewhere down in here, somewhere near the base of the androecium or the base of the pistil is where the nectaries are. By virtue of the animals having to kind of struggle a little bit to get down into that part of the flower, they pick up pollen grains on whatever particular appendage of their body they're using to obtain that nectar. So in this case, it's the proboscis of a sphinx moth. And so this sphinx moth is going to pick up all kinds of pollen grains on its proboscis as it's feeding off this nectar. What's this sphinx moth going to do next? It's going to go to another flower and try to get some more nectar. What's it going to do inadvertently in the process? It's going to deposit some of those pollen grains onto the stigma of the pistil, allowing those pollen grains to potentially grow their pollen tube down to the ovary, thereby, after the fact, sending both their generative and tube cells into that ovary with the hopes of fertilizing the eggs within. And so we can see many examples of this, not just in sphinx moths and orchids, but also yucca moths and yuccas. And so there's a very interesting relationship between these yucca moths. They're in the genus Teguticula. And what are these yucca moths doing? They're actually not hanging around yucca flowers so much because they're into the nectar, but because this is a great place for them to lay their eggs. And as their larvae develop in the yucca flowers, their larvae can use the yucca flowers as a food source. So as these yucca moths are hanging out in these yucca flowers, laying their eggs, they are inadvertently picking up a bunch of pollen grains. And as these yucca moths are sort of visiting different yucca flowers, they are inadvertently transferring the pollen of one yucca plant to the stigma of another. Again, this is not just unique to moths, but we can see other insects that have pollination syndromes, such as honeybees, which are some of the most famous pollinators, not just of wild species, but also of domestic crop species. This is a honeybee going after the nectar of a mint flower, probably many mint flowers. And again, in the process of this honeybee collecting or feeding on this nectar, it's also picking up pollen all over its body and inadvertently transferring that pollen around. Of course, we know that honeybees use pollen for other purposes. And if you were to look at a honeybee closely, I don't have an image here, you'd see that they have these little pollen sacs they carry on the back of their bodies. So they will purposefully collect pollen from the anthers of these flowers, and they'll pack it into these little sacs that they carry around, and they'll take it back to their colonies and use that pollen for other purposes, probably for as a sugar source, as a food source, maybe to make honey. But in the process of visiting all these different flowers, in this case, mint flowers, this honeybee is transferring pollen from the anther of one mint plant to the stigma of another, thereby again allowing that pollen grain to potentially grow its pollen tube down and fertilize the eggs within. We can see similar relationships with butterflies and lilies. And these are all examples of insect pollination syndromes, but there are other animal pollination syndromes that are not exclusive to insects. We can see these in vertebrates. So here is a picture of Anna's hummingbird, which you may have seen before. These are common birds in Southern California. They're probably only about that big. They're, of course, very, very agile and active birds that can hover in midair. And by virtue of basically having such a high metabolic rate, they're constantly feeding on nectar in order to have a constant supply of carbohydrates. And by virtue of these birds needing to constantly feed on nectar, they're constantly visiting flowers that often bear pollen. And like we saw in these insect examples, they're inadvertently picking up these pollen grains and taking them from the anther of one flower and sort of depositing them onto the stigma of another completely by accident. And these flowers have become dependent upon that service that these hummingbirds provide for them. And we can even see this in bats. So these, I think, are agave flowers here. They're certainly monocot flowers. It looks like agave flowers to me. And these bats, which are nocturnal pollinators of these agaves. And so they'll feed on the nectar of these agaves. Again, inadvertently picking up pollen from the anthers. And as they travel from flower to flower, from plant to plant, they're inadvertently transferring the pollen of one plant to the pistils of another, thereby allowing fertilization to happen. So all of these examples, and these are just a few examples, are plant species with flowers that have evolved morphologies, both in their shape, their structure, and their color, that attract various pollinators in order to really ensure that fertilization is going to happen, and really specifically ensuring that cross fertilization is going to happen, so that these plants, many of which are hermaphrodites, are not undergoing self-fertilization. And in some cases, these morphologies are very extreme, such as we see in these orchids. Or in these mints, if we look closely, we'd see that the bilateral symmetry of mints is such that they have these lips, these upper lips and these lower lips that their corollas are comprised of. And these lower lips make an excellent landing platform for insects such as bees to land on. The bees can land on that platform and have an ease of access to getting nectar, and of course, an ease of access to pick up pollen grains inadvertently. So a lot of interesting things are going on with pollination syndromes, but they are extremely important for the overwhelming majority of flowering plants, both monocots and eudicots. And of course, many of our agricultural species depend upon these pollinators for reproductive success. And if species such as honeybees were to go extinct or significantly decline in abundance, our crop species might not do very well at reproducing unless we were to go around and pollinate all of them by hand, which obviously is an extremely tedious task. And we'd much rather rely on these very, very effective honeybees at doing that task for us. So some other interesting kinds of plants that we see have evolved within angiosperms are parasitic plants and also carnivorous plants. And so it's kind of odd to think about plants as being parasites, but there are many species that can parasitize generally other plants, other host plants. A classic example in California are members of the genus Cuscuta, also known as dodder, or some people call it witch's hair, because you can see large aggregations of dodder covering host plants. Kind of has this angel hair pasta look. So this orange stuff here represents basically the vegetative body of Cuscuta, and these are actually the flowers of Cuscuta. And you'll notice that this plant is not green. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that this plant is probably not doing photosynthesis. In fact, this plant is not capable of doing photosynthesis. How is this plant getting sugar? Well, what it does is its seeds that are formed after fertilization will germinate on the stems of host plants and tap into the roots of those host plants via some specialized structures we call haustoria, and they'll start stealing sugar and water from that host plant. And this is not a great thing for the host plant, but it is a great thing for the parasite. And so these plants make an excellent living by parasitizing all kinds of hosts. Now, some people have called them invasive. I wouldn't call them invasive. This is a naturally evolved relationship. Yes, they're parasitic. It's a positive relationship for the Cuscuta and a negative relationship for the host, but it indeed is a naturally evolved relationship that Cuscuta has developed as a native species with a number of native hosts. So I wouldn't necessarily wander around calling this a bad thing. It's a naturally evolved process, albeit a negative one for the host. We call we call plant parasites that cannot do photosynthesis at all holoparasites. In contrast, we could talk about plant parasites that are capable of doing limited photosynthesis, but are still not super great at it and still have kind of a hard time obtaining water and nutrients from the environment. And those are what we call hemiparasites, or sort of like halfway parasites. Plants in the genus Phoradendron are probably one of the most classic example of hemiparasites we have in California. These are called mistletoes. You've probably heard of them. And phoradendrons are pretty common parasites of conifers and also hardwood deciduous trees. And there are specific species of Phoradendron that specialize on junipers and specific species of Phoradendron that specialize on hardwood trees. But nevertheless, these parasites have evolved to become parasites of very specific hosts. And so they'll do something similar to what we see in Cuscuta. Their seeds will germinate on a host plant. And as that seed germinates, it'll put down a haustorium that will tap into the vascular system of the host plant. And that's the xylem and phloem. So that haustoria will start stealing water from the xylem and sugars from the phloem. And that will make a very happy Phoradendron plant. And then we can start asking questions about whether or not this has a negative influence on the host plant. In hemiparasites, sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. These hosts can still live perfectly normal lives, despite the fact that they've been parasitized by species such as Phoradendron. In some cases, we can see that Phoradendron parasitism has become so extensive to the fact that it can have a fairly negative impact on the plant host. So it just kind of depends on the magnitude of the parasitism. But these things are pretty commonplace to see. This image on the bottom right here, by the way, shows a magnified view of what Phoradendron leaves actually look like. They're kind of succulent, but they are green and they are capable of doing some photosynthesis. It's just that they're getting a little bit of extra help from their host plant. And then we can talk about carnivorous plants, and carnivorous plants are really doing something completely different. They're not parasites by any stretch of the imagination. They undergo their own photosynthesis. They make their own sugars, but they have developed adaptations that allow them to digest other living things, typically small invertebrates, usually insects. Why might they have evolved to do this? Well, as it turns out, species such as Drosera and Dionea occur in really nutrient-poor environments. These are the sundews and the Venus flytraps, which you've probably heard of before. So what are these nutrient-poor environments? Well, oftentimes these are things like bogs, kind of like swamps. And these kinds of environments often are devoid of certain important plant nutrients such as phosphates or nitrates that these plants need in order to undergo their normal physiological processes, in order to undergo cell division, for example. And so how can these plants get nutrients from the environment if they can't get those nutrients from the soil? In fact, they don't really have much soil around them at all. They occur in bogs, which are composed mostly of things like peat moss and water and maybe some decayed organic matter, but they don't typically occur in true soils or very well-developed soils. And I'd actually be curious to know to what extent they have relationships with mycorrhizal fungi or not. I would predict that they might not have any such relationship, which might explain why they have a hard time getting nutrients from the environment. So how do they get nutrients from the environment? They've evolved strategies that allow them to attract small invertebrates, and then they trap those small invertebrates. And then they have enzymes that slowly digest those small invertebrates, allowing the nutrients within those invertebrates to be taken up by the plant bodies and then used for various physiological processes. So in sundews, the mechanism that allows them to trap invertebrates are these trichomes. And these trichomes are very glandular. They're extremely sticky. And so these sundews will attract invertebrates who potentially want to feed on those trichomes for their sugary resources. But once those invertebrates come into contact with these really glandular trichomes, they get stuck because the trichomes are so sticky. And then the sundew will curl around on its prey and slowly start to digest it once that prey has deceased. And this is a pretty effective strategy that has evolved in sundews to enable them to consume these invertebrates as a nutrient food source. Likewise, we see something in Venus flytraps. Venus flytraps attract invertebrates, and invertebrates will typically land inside the pads of these flytraps. These are really bizarre structures that these plants produce. And there are chemical systems within those pads that are sensitive to being touched. So if you were to poke one with a toothpick, it would snap shut, or you poked it with a Q-tip, it would snap shut. And that is basically the same thing that happens when an invertebrate lands inside that pad. It cues those chemical signals to snap that pair of pads shut, which look a lot like a mouth with teeth. So they've evolved some structures that are not terribly different than we see in some animals. But nevertheless, that insect will never be able to get out of that trap, and it will also slowly be digested by enzymes produced by the plant, and that plant will take up important nutrients from that invertebrate prey and integrate it into its own normal physiology. So these are some interesting strategies that we've seen evolve in plants that occur in really nutrient-poor environments, and likewise, some strategies we've seen evolve in plants that aren't super great at gaining nutrients or that might not be super great at doing photosynthesis. In some cases, plants that can't do photosynthesis at all that have evolved to be parasitic. Some other interesting adaptations that we have seen emerge in plants are the production of so-called secondary chemicals or secondary metabolites. And what are these? Well, basically, plants undergo normal metabolism like any living thing does, and their metabolism can be kind of complicated. And sometimes, as a byproduct of their normal metabolism, they produce secondary metabolites or secondary chemicals. And as it has turned out, oftentimes these secondary metabolites have become selected for in various plant lineages because they are very effective at deterring herbivores from eating these plants, because oftentimes these chemicals are toxic. And of course, we have identified in Western science that many of these secondary compounds are useful in medicine. So obviously, morphine has been used in the production of opiate drugs. Cocaine maybe has some medicinal properties, or at least originally was used for them, maybe not so much now as it's used as a recreational drug. Things like caffeine and nicotine obviously are used to a certain extent as recreational drugs. We enjoy the effects of these things, although they are technically toxins. We can also talk about the way that flowering plants tend to be dispersed in the environment. And obviously, a lot of that is an artifact of them producing fruits and seeds. So really, plant gene flow and dispersal and colonization really depends upon their fruits and seeds getting moved around somehow. And this could happen by wind, and it could happen in water. There are examples of plants that disperse their seeds and fruits by wind or water. But there are also many examples of plants that disperse their fruits and seeds by animal vectors. So yet again, we're seeing an example where plants kind of depend upon animal vectors for moving around their offspring. So there are a few classic examples of this. We can talk about something called endozoochory. An endozoochory is a situation where an animal, such as this bird, might consume the seeds of a fruit. In this example, we're seeing this bird that is devouring the seeds of this cactus fruit, nearly decimating this fruit to pieces, consuming those seeds. And what's going to happen? Well, this bird is going to digest those seeds, and it's mostly going to digest the fruit. Actually, the seed itself can survive the process of digestion. And of course, eventually this bird is going to defecate out that seed at some point, but it's probably going to defecate it out somewhere else. And by defecating that seed out somewhere else, it has done the plant a favor by dispersing that seed away to a new environment where that seed can potentially germinate and give rise to a new population of those plants. So endozoochory is thought of as a pretty important means by which plant seeds can be dispersed in the environment by animals. Likewise, we can see this in Phainopepla. In fact, Phainopepla are famous for dispersing the seeds of mistletoes. So these mistletoes are flowering plants. When they do flower, they'll probably get pollinated, and if they're pollinated, they'll probably produce fruits that contain their seeds, and Phainopepla love to feed on those fruits. And if you've ever seen mistletoe fruits, you know that they're really super sticky. And so these Phainopepla are kind of famous for gorging on these fruits, but then those fruits often get stuck to their beaks. And so what do the Phainopepla do to try to remove those fruits from their beaks? They'll often wipe off the sticky mess from their beak onto the stem or a branch of their host plant. What do you think is going to happen to the fruit of that mistletoe if it is found on the stem of a potential host plant because a Phainopepla left it there. That's right. It might germinate on the stem of that host plant, and if it does, it'll form a hostoria, and a new mistletoe plant will grow, and there'll be a whole new parasitic relationship going on there. So via endozoochory, via interesting form of endozoochory, we see that Phainopepla can move around seeds of mistletoes, kind of like these birds are moving around these seeds of these cactus. Yet another form of animal-mediated plant dispersal is ectozoochory. And so endozoochory means basically internal dispersal or internal dispersal of seeds. Ectozoochory means external dispersal of seeds or fruits. And in this case, we can talk about plants that are really barbed or have really barbed fruits, such as this cocklebur. And this is just one example. There are many, many angiosperms that produce fruits that have barbs or sticky-like structures that make them really effective at sticking to the hair of mammalian vectors, such as this dog. Or your socks, for example. If you go out hiking in cocklebur country, you might get back to the car and find that you have about a dozen or two cocklebur fruits on each leg. And if you didn't do anything about it, you might effectively disperse these cocklebur fruits off to new areas where, again, they could establish new populations, or where they could germinate and develop individuals who could exchange genes with other individuals from other populations. And so this so-called hitchhiker dispersal has been selected for in many plant species, because simply by having animals such as mammals tread through a field of plants that produce these fruits, the mammals will pick up tons of them and inadvertently disperse them away to new environments, effectively allowing these plants to disperse. Something similar happens really quite purposefully in ants. Now, ants maybe aren't trying to disperse plant fruits, but they are definitely trying to pick them up and move them around. And we call this myrmecochory. And this is very common in harvester ants. And we have a lot of harvester ants in California, especially in desert areas. They do really well in sort of wide open, sandy environments. And basically, colonies of harvester ants will send their workers out who will spend most of their lives gathering plant materials, usually leaves or seeds or entire fruits. And by virtue of tons and tons of workers spending tons and tons of time and energy in moving around the fruits and seeds of plants, those plant seeds are being dispersed to new locations. Now, of course, ants aren't moving maybe as far as these birds or maybe as far as mammals, but they're moving nonetheless. And they are capable of taking the offspring of a particular plant and moving that offspring away from the parent plant to a new environment where that offspring could potentially germinate, where that seed could potentially germinate and form a new parent plant, maybe starting a new population, or at least forming a new individual, again, who could potentially exchange genes with individuals from other populations. So ants are really thought of as ecosystem engineers because of this behavior, because they can really shape the distribution of plants within the environment because they're so actively moving plant seeds around basically all day long. This is what they do for a living. And we can oftentimes try to think about plant communities where there are harvester ants having their structure and composition in some way being shaped by the action of these ants. And then probably the simplest form of dispersal we can think about is anemochory or wind dispersal. So this is commonly happening in dandelions. These are a bunch of dandelion fruits. You've probably seen these before. Each of these little tufts actually has a fruit attached to it that's called an achene. And if you don't know this, achenes are actually sunflower seeds. They're analogous to sunflower seeds. It's just that in dandelions, they're really, really small. But inside of those achenes are the seeds. And attached to those achenes are these little wings, which are the white tuft-like structures. And those wings effectively allow those seeds to get caught up in the air and travel relatively long distances away from their parent plant where they disperse in a new environment, presumably to germinate and form yet a new population of plants. So again, plant gene flow, plant dispersal and colonization very much can depend upon these kinds of animal vectors or by chance events such as wind dispersal. And it makes a lot of sense for plants to have evolved to depend upon these strategies because plants can't really move. I mean, they can move around in the wind, but a plant can't really consciously pick itself up and move to a new environment very easily. These plants really do depend upon some type of an external vector to take their offspring, their progeny, and move them to new locations, whether they're relatively close to the host or relatively close to the parent plant, such as in these examples, or relatively far from the parent plant. And in these last few slides, I just kind of want to look at how we as a species, Homo sapiens, very much depend upon plants for our own survival in a multitude of ways. The first, of course, being as food sources. So our ancestors have been consuming plants since the origins of our evolution, or the evolution of the lineage giving rise to our species. And that probably was first realized in hunter-gatherer societies. But about 11,000 years ago, human populations started to figure out how to domesticate plants. And different human populations in different parts of the world figured out how to domesticate all kinds of different plant species, most of which turn out to be flowering plants, angiosperms. And so most of our major crop species include things that are seed producers, or things that produce fruits, or even things that produce tubers, which are these very specialized underground structures that plants will use to store carbohydrates for long periods of time, like potatoes, for example. And so we as humans have developed this interesting relationship with plants, specifically by domesticating them. Not only have we figured out how to select certain traits in these plants that we desire, such as in corn, where we've artificially bred ancestral teosinte, which is basically corn that's about this, that produces fruits that are about this big, and into modern day corn that you can buy in the store that produces fruits that are about that big. And this is true of many of the other domestic crops that we have developed as well, such as wheat and rice, where we have selected for the best strains that can survive domestication and can survive in a multitude of different climate zones that we can rely on growing huge fields of in order to feed relatively large populations. Probably the most important plant functional trait is not just productivity, like how fast can they grow, but how much water they use. And not all plants use the same amount of water, which isn't surprising because not all plants evolved in the same kinds of environments. Generally speaking, we know that in land plants, there's this gradual evolution away from wet environments towards increasingly drier environments. And we might expect that there's a sort of corroboration with a general evolution of plants that have become increasingly more water use efficient as they've evolved in areas that have less and less available water. And so what do we know? Well, we do know that plant productivity really depends upon two things: transpiration, which technically is termed evapotranspiration, and water use efficiency. So first, let's talk about transpiration. Well, transpiration is kind of this fancy term for water evaporating from the stomata of plant leaves. And it can vary a lot across time, and it can vary a lot across space, and it can vary a lot from one species to the next. Some species transpire water more than others. Some species are really adapted to be efficient, and some species are adapted to be not super efficient. But basically, all plant species that have vascular systems have to deal with this thing we call water potential. And this is kind of a little bit complicated of a situation, but basically, vascular plants have root systems and vascular tissue within their stems that's connected to their shoots, and their shoots have leaves that have stomata. And effectively, what's happening is that plants have this relationship with water pressure, both in the soil and in the atmosphere. And we call that water pressure the plant's water potential. Basically, the water potential of plants is highest where the concentration of water is highest, and that's typically in the roots. So plants have the highest water potential where they're taking up water from the soil, and here it is taken at a value of negative 0.2 megapascals. It is measured on a negative scale, and that's because water potential is at its highest when it's equal to zero. Understanding that's probably beyond the scope of our class, but basically pure water has a potential of zero, but a lot of water has stuff dissolved in it that makes its potential less than zero. And then when water has to move against the force of gravity, its potential becomes increasingly negative, such as we see as water travels up through the stem of a tree, through the xylem. And so once we get to leaves at the tip of this tree, we see that the water potential has decreased quite a bit. It's much lower than it was in the roots or in the stem. And we can see that the environment that has the lowest water potential of all is the atmosphere. So what does that mean? What's going on? What it means is that these plants are basically, via evaporation, drawing water from the soil up through their stems, through their vascular tissue, through xylem, from areas of increasingly, from areas of low water, from areas of high water potential to areas of increasingly lower water potential where water is evaporating into the atmosphere. So this is an interesting property of plant physiology, and it's also what's driving photosynthesis. Because if plants weren't undergoing transpiration or evapotranspiration, they wouldn't have water drawn into cells that are doing photosynthesis. Thereby, they wouldn't have water available to do photosynthesis. Anyway, a little bit of a complicated story there, but how does this affect a plant's water use efficiency? Well, plants that are effective at fixing a lot of carbon without having a lot of water evaporate are really efficient compared to plants that can only fix a little bit of carbon and lose a lot of water in the process. And that, by definition, is a plant's water use efficiency. So this graph on the right shows evapotranspiration basically on the x-axis going from low to high, and the amount of carbon fixed on the y-axis going from low to high. So what's going on here? Well, plants that can fix a lot of carbon without losing a lot of water through transpiration are very water use efficient, sort of as indicated with this line here. Lots of sugar is being fixed, lots of carbon is being fixed, not a lot of water is being used in the process. In contrast, plants that are kind of using increasingly more amounts of water to fix carbon are less water use efficient. So this lower line here shows an example of a plant that might not fix a whole lot of carbon, it's not making a lot of sugar, but even to make a small amount of sugar, it's losing a lot of water in the process. So we would say that it's not a very water use efficient plant. So different plants have different levels of water use efficiency, and a lot of it is rooted in the kinds of environments that they evolved in, the kind of climatic conditions that they're adapted to. Basically, how much sugar can they fix for the amount of water that is lost in the process via this process of evapotranspiration. And then the relationship between plants and the environment, and I guess we could throw humans into the mix, really is intricately related to the carbon cycle. And so plants and the carbon cycle are actively moving energy through the biosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, all the time. This has probably been going on since the origins of photosynthesis, and the situation has probably only become more complicated now with the advent of human technology. And so what is the carbon cycle? Well, let's start by talking about abiotic or non-living sources of carbon dioxide, such as perhaps volcanoes. These might have been some of the earliest sources of carbon dioxide in the Earth's history. And this carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere. It becomes a dissolved gas in the atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide can be taken up by photosynthetic organisms, such as plants, or even cyanobacteria, or photosynthetic protists. Let's just say carbon dioxide is taken up by terrestrial land plants like this tree. And then the fate of that carbon dioxide after it's fixed into sugar kind of depends. In some cases, that carbon that is fixed could simply decompose, and that decomposed carbon could sort of end up in the soil, and it either could get decomposed by things like fungi, or could remain in the soil for really long periods of time where it becomes fossilized and turned into things like crude oil or natural gas. Or that carbon could be consumed by animals, such as us or our livestock. And if we consume that carbon or our animals consume that carbon, then we're going to in turn turn it back into carbon dioxide, where it's going to re-enter the atmosphere, thereby re-entering the carbon cycle where it's available for plants to use once again to be fixed into sugar. And then in some cases, we might take things like wood and we might burn wood. And as that wood is burned, we're performing combustion, and that causes more carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere. Or we might be taking fossil fuels, which are decomposed carbon sources, and burning them, combusting them, either in factories or automobiles or other forms of transportation, where that carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere. And so there is this cycling of carbon through the entire geosphere that kind of goes back and forth from living systems to non-living systems. And this has been going on naturally for a very long period of time. But what's kind of happening nowadays is that by virtue of us really burning a lot of either biofuels, which are like dead forms of living things, or like fossil fuels, which are dead forms of living things that have been dead for a really long time. By virtue of us burning those kinds of things, we are causing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere to become unusually high. And when the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere becomes unusually high, it causes the Earth's atmosphere to become unusually warm because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And so it drives the so-called greenhouse effect. And as the Earth's atmosphere warms, it starts to contribute to global warming, which contributes to climate change. And so there are some major implications involving the human input into the carbon cycle, because we tend to allow more carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere than would naturally. So that's kind of a problem. We can kind of negate that problem by sequestering carbon in plants. So one of the reasons why people like to plant trees all over the place is because trees take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they can hold it in their bodies. And even after those trees decompose, they can still hold that carbon dioxide in soil. So this graphic here kind of indicates which kind of ecosystems hold the most organic carbon. And it's certainly, again, most abundant in living plants and the soil that surrounds them. And most carbon is held in tropical ecosystems. Not surprisingly, they're the most productive ecosystems on the planet. To a lesser extent, we see carbon being held in less productive ecosystems, not so much in, say, boreal dry forests or deserts, but nevertheless, plants are really effective at holding carbon, which prevents that carbon from entering the atmosphere, which helps to negate the effects of carbon dioxide being a greenhouse gas, rather helps to negate the effects of global warming. We also know that a lot of carbon is sequestered in fossil fuels, such again as crude oil or natural gas. And we might just say that it's best to leave these fossil fuels where they are, because if we extract them, not only are we basically contributing to environmental degradation, but the purpose of extracting them is to burn them, to combust them. And if we are burning and combusting fossil fuels, what do you think is going to happen? Well, as they're burnt and combusted, they're going to contribute to increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, which again contributes to increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases, which increases the greenhouse effect, which increases global warming, which has a whole cascade of various effects that mostly are negative, including ocean acidification, including climate change, by and large, making our planet less and less inhabitable, not just for our own species, but for many of the other species that we share this planet with as well. So the kind of long story here is that the carbon cycle is happening. We are part of it. We might exacerbate it by burning fossil fuels or burning biofuels. And we really do rely upon global carbon reservoirs for keeping that carbon in a state that prevents it from entering the Earth's atmosphere, thereby contributing to global warming and climate change. So carbon sequestration by not just flowering plants, but really by any photosynthetic plants is a really, really important process that we actually depend upon for keeping our plant habitable. So that's basically the end of the story. We reviewed the sort of evolutionary history of flowering plants. These are plants that are probably the most adapted to life in increasingly arid environments compared to the non-flowering plants, which have some similar adaptations, but flowering plants kind of represent the final stage, or at least the final stage that we've yet to see of plants evolving into increasingly stressful conditions where water is not always super available. They have evolved flowers that depend upon pollinators in order for reproduction to happen. In many cases, they have evolved specialized fruits, which can now hold seeds and allow seeds a vehicle in which they can disperse and survive desiccation for long periods of time. Obviously, seeds are an older adaptation that allow plant embryos to remain dormant and resist desiccation for long periods of time. But now in angiosperms, we see those seeds packaged within little enclosed vesicles or vehicles rather that we call fruits. And that's a pretty important innovation. And we think that that innovation has to be important because it's something that's led to such widespread diversification within angiosperms. Some 300,000 plus species all use these same traits in all types of ecosystems all over the globe. And of course, we depend upon these plants not just as a source of food and medicine, but they really are the basis of all terrestrial ecosystems. And without terrestrial ecosystems, our species certainly wouldn't be here. So that's pretty much it for our discussion of land plants. I hope you learned something. See you next time.